The whole chapter about Salman Rushdie, who is a genius at this kind of thing. And with Salman one day, it was a dinner, and someone arrived late, having been delayed on a flight. And he said, I had a terrible time being delayed on this plane. And not only was it a bore being delayed, but there was nothing to read at the airport bookstore except Robert Ludlum stuff. And he said, I had to buy one, and I knew it would be bad. I had no idea how bad it would be. And that didn't seem very controversial or interesting. So he went on about it, though, and said, I mean, it's the titles, these crap titles like, I don't know, the Eiger Sanction, or you know how it goes. They're so bad I can't even remember them. But you know what I'm talking about. And then, by good chance, someone said, well, what would a Shakespeare play be like if Robert Ludlum had written it? And Salman looked up like that and said, okay. And I said, all right, well, what would Hamlet be? And he said, the Elsinore Vacillation. With no more time than I gave you. And I said, well, all right, but you can't do that twice. What about Macbeth? He said, the Dunsinane Reforestation. And
so he could go on that as well.
We went on through the kerchief implication, the Rialto Sanction. He's a genius. And he then invented one all of his own, which was the titles of books that didn't quite make it. Nice Try, The Big Gatsby, Good Expectations, let me think, For Whom the Bell Rings, Mr. Zhivago, and I think I contributed at this point Portrait of a Woman, which I loved. But then he said, this I think is almost the best, 2 days in the life of Ivan Denisovich. He can just do that, okay? But what people want, I find, is filth, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so why don't you change the word love to fuck and see what happens there?
And you're not bad at rhyming your filth either. You've spoken... Well, you've written about feeling some limitations as a writer compared to your august friends. And I might get you to comment a bit more seriously on that later.
No, I should do that now.
Okay, well, I'll do it now then.
Well, it was very useful to me working at the New Statesman, which was then a pretty good politico-literary magazine in London, some prestige to it, with Martin and with James Fenton, who I still think is the best poet writing in English, and Ian McEwan and others, Julian Barnes, all on the staff or on the contributing periphery. It was very handy for me because just by talking to them, listening to them, I learned a lot about writing by osmosis almost. But I also realized that people who can do fiction and poetry have an ingredient of stuff that I don't have. And so I thought, my little ambitions for the bottom drawer, that slim volume, I think I'm not going to waste the public's time with that. I'll concentrate on the essay form. There I think I might contribute something. And I've since then evolved a theory of a sort that those who have poetic and fictional capacity, which I don't possess, have musical ability, which is another thing I don't have. When confronted with musical notation, I feel dyslexic almost. I just don't have it. And I've been told by some critics and professors of literature much senior to myself that I may well be onto something with this. And then if you think about it, I mean, Shakespeare is practically a musician. He's full of music. So is Chaucer. The Romantic poets are a lot of the Russians. Nabokov didn't like music, but he understood it. Dickens was a musician. I'm going to press this on, and Ian McEwan could write a review of a concert, whether it was jazz or classical, easily. Several of Salman's novels are practically set to music. Martin can play. I think it might be a useful way of introducing different styles of ability.
You certainly describe Bob Dylan as a poet.
Bob Dylan's certainly a poet, yes. Yes.
But you have dabbled at least in some forms of verse, mainly dirty. Do you say you've got a good memory? Any limericks that spring to mind?
See, people expect filth at this point. The limerick
More filth is what
the
they
limerick
expect.
is a very capacious and elastic and subtle form. I would give you the example of the young engine driver named Hunt, who was given an engine to shunt, saw a runaway truck, by yelling out "duck," saved the life of the fellow in front. You see, I know what you wanted there. Whereas Robert Conquest, who is another member of this luncheon, he's now 94, he's born in 1917, a great historian, principally of the Russian Revolution, but of Stalinism, and the master with Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis of the limerick. And everyone here knows the speech from As You Like It, The Seven Ages of Man, Jacques' address on all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely peers. They have their exits and their entrances, and each man in his time plays many parts, these being seven ages, right? You got it in your head?
See, at the Opera House, you were doing Monty Python, so we're really stepping up.
I can do the Philosopher's Song too, if you want. Yeah. But so here's the Seven Ages of Man as done by Robert Conquest. 7 ages. First puking and mewling, then very pissed off with your schooling, then fucks and then fights, then judging chaps' rights, then sitting in slippers, then drooling.
Shakespeare was so damn verbose.
Jacques' delivery is 28 lines, and this is 5 short ones. And Conquest also did the history of the Russian Revolution in a limerick.
I don't suppose you can recall it, can you?
There once was a fellow named Lenin who did 2 or 3 million men in. That's a lot to have done in, but where he did 1 in, that old bastard Stalin did 10 in. And then Calvin's theory of predestination can be done in a limerick too.
And do you recall it?
There once was a man who said, "Damn, it is borne in upon me I am, a creature that moves in predestinate grooves. I'm not even a bus, I'm a tram." But just not to disappoint, there was a young hooker from Kew who filled up her pussy with glue and said, with a grin, "Since they'll pay to get in, they can pay to get out of it too." You see, that's what they wanted. Such a dead giveaway. Wasted the Shakespeare on them. Totally wasted.
Now, look, I hope at this point you'll afford me the courtesy that I think Isaiah Berlin afforded you of providing a polite answer to a question that you get asked all the time about the things that you didn't write about in the memoir. But I wanted to ask one thing that I haven't heard you asked about yet. You don't write much about your brother.
No.
Why not? Because, I mean, you've had a very public history.
Yes, and I thought that people can already read that if they want to. So I didn't want to go over old ground at all. And because, since we were very small, we haven't lived in the same town or been in the same job or had very much contact.
Have you discussed that with him? Is he a bit miffed?
No, he's not miffed at all. I mean, I don't think he would particularly want to be in my book. I'm in his new book, which is actually a very interesting book just published called The Rage Against God, which is his defense of the Anglican religion against people like myself. And it has a long and actually rather beautiful, nostalgic account of a lost Christian England in the 50s when we were small. The cathedral close, the security and deference of Britain, something that he wishes could come back. And I don't miss particularly in that way at all. And I feature in that a bit.
We've talked about some of your great friendships. Obviously, in the changes of your political positions over the years, you've probably lost a few friends as well. Are there any that hurt to have lost?
Well, I should say first I also made some very nice friends.
Sure. Paul Wolfowitz?
For example. Many handsome and beautiful and brave Iraqis and Kurds who I wouldn't have met if I hadn't been on their side in getting rid of the private ownership of their country by a psychopathic crime family. I prefer the new ones to the ones I lost. in that respect. Thank you, by the way. It's quite rare and very restrained.
There's something of an expectation that there might be other people joining.
No, I don't think so. But it's nice to know there are some people who get that point. And I mean, look, Martin wrote a book about communism, which I thought was very bad and said was bad, and which misrepresented my opinions, I think unintentionally, but to me annoyingly. But I would never make a political disagreement a cause of a quarrel with a friend. I mean, I think it's silly to do that. But there's a tendency on the left, and I bet there are people here who know what I'm talking about, to think that if someone in any way disagrees with the left, it must be for the lowest possible reason. And that if you found the lowest possible motive, you found the right one. There's this whole culture of no one would leave us or quarrel with us if they weren't a sellout. It's actually a very sick mentality and very widespread. And people who think like that or feel like that can dump me if they want. But that's almost as much as to say that they weren't much of a friend. Anyway, I'll pull myself together and go out and find someone nice to be friends with.
So who do you rate highest?
Or someone more principled, perhaps, or more courageous.
Okay, well, who do you rate highest of your new friends?
That would be telling.
I was asking.
Not telling you, sweetie. You wouldn't know their names, but I mean, they are people in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere who are on, I won't say on my side, who are on our side, on the side of civilization against barbarism and theocracy. They're worth knowing. It's been a wonderful thing in my life to find them and count them as friends. It's a matter of elementary internationalist, socialist solidarity to me, to be on their side and on the side of their long-oppressed women folk. Actually, I will give you a couple of examples. It seems to me that the three most beautiful words in the secular language now are Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's become a great friend of mine, and who's that's better, and who has been through rape, genital mutilation, forced marriage to a relative or close relative, beaten, brutally treated, exiled, and so on, and who genuinely considers herself to be a lucky person because she's probably the only survivor of her class in Somalia who's still alive and who witnesses for the most important thing of all in this combat, which is the rights of women, and the empowerment of women is the only cure we know to poverty and deprivation. And just being able to find myself a friend of hers and speak up for her and say a few words in her behalf is, I tell you, is worth a lot of disapproving gazes from Michael Moore, say, who is, of course, also very beautiful in his own way.
You obviously, your stance is on Islamofascism, which I think you claim to you've coined.
Well, not quite. I mean, when I wrote my reaction piece to 9/11, I said it's fascism with an Islamic face, which is a borrowing that some of the older comrades here will remember from what Alexander Dubček said about socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia, and what Susan Sontag said at a very famous meeting in solidarity with Poland in 1982, that the military dictatorship in Poland was fascism with a human face. But you can't say fascism with an Islamic face every single time. So, and anyway, not everyone's going to get the reference every single time. So it got a bit compressed into Islamofascism, which doesn't quite have the same resonance. But there we are. We need a word for it.
But you've written, as I say, very publicly, and everyone knows the kind of the changes or the perceived changes in your position on these things and supporting the war in Iraq. You've also written at great length and fantastically about founding fathers, and in particular Jefferson. Does it trouble you that even if you obviously felt you're on the right side of the argument in relation to Iraq, that some of the ways in which that conflict has been prosecuted, and in particular long-term detention without trial, that in fact you can be on the right side of an argument but still potentially fundamentally undermine the values which define a nation?
Yeah, you can. I mean, I remember going to Abu Ghraib not long after the liberation of Baghdad, and where I divide people, by the way, between those who knew about Abu Ghraib before 2003 and those who walk around as if it was a prison opened by the United States for its own purposes after 2003. If you didn't know about Abu Ghraib before 2003, be very modest in what you say about it. But it was a place where, at one point, it was an industrial execution shed and torture chamber where hundreds of people were hanged every day, often from the same beam at the same time, and where, when it became overcrowded and the numbers needed to be culled, the guards would go out with the list of names around Baghdad and go to the families and say, "We can keep your son off the list for execution if you give us 1,000 dinars," and so on. Impossible to deepen the night, the sort of the pornographic element of the Saddam Hussein regime, and the smell of the place when it was broken open is with me still. And I remember saying to the people I was with, don't use this anymore. Don't try and convert it into a prison. This place needs fire from heaven. It should just be blown up and salt should be sown in the ruins. Don't try and use it. It's evil. I actually think evil is a word you have to use. You can't do without it. And evil has a particular stench, and I can personally claim to have smelled it, winded it, scented it. Anyway, no one listens to me. I often think that's, a lot of what's wrong. And they ignored me. And the place did become a nightmare. Nothing like on the same scale. I won't even have that suggested. Prison conditions in Iraq have vastly improved since the arrival of the coalition forces. Anyone who doesn't know that is a fool. But recreational torture on video, these people. And I wrote and I said and I believe that it didn't change my attitude towards torture. I mean, I've been waterboarded because I wanted to find out what it was like. I thought the main contribution I could make was to see, well, is this torture or not? Yes, it is. It didn't change my attitude towards torture. It very nearly changed my attitude towards capital punishment. I thought the people who did that in Abu Ghraib should have been taken out and shot. I would have protested against it eventually if they were put up against the wall, but I wouldn't have had my heart completely in it. It would have been nice to have them shot out of hand. Well, a brief and fair trial, but then shot out of hand.
So, how long did you last in the waterboarding? I've seen the footage, but
no, you have. Well, not very long the first time, because everything in you reacts to the sensation of being drowned. By the way, you read in the newspapers, it mimics the sensation of being drowned. It's not at all that. You are being drowned, except slowly. So your whole body goes into a spasm of resistance to this, and time has no meaning at all. But when I looked at the clock, I thought, Jesus, no son of Commander Hitchens should have wimped out as fast as that. So I asked them to do it again. I lasted a few more seconds, but the point was pretty easily made by then. And for quite a long time afterwards, I shouldn't say post-traumatic stress disorder, because many honourable warriors who've been through much worse than that have had that, but I did have very bad nightmares, which I never have nightmares, and I kept all the time thinking that I was being choked and was drowning. It didn't go away for quite a long time.
So that's waterboarding. How do you think you'd go with whiskey boarding?
Well, guy goes into a bar, says, "I'd like a glass of James Walker, please." Barman says, "You mean Johnny, don't you?" Said, "Not when you know him as well as I do." People are constantly surprised by this, but I can actually take a drink and manage it, handle it, carry on apparently ambulant.
I think it's actually one of the stronger arguments against atheism. I believe your liver is a miracle.
People come from far and wide, yeah. No, I have some advice for boozers in my book. I mean, the thing is, don't mix, very important. Try not to drink on an empty stomach, drink plenty of water, dance with the one that brung you, all that kind of thing. And don't use it to cure the blues, for example. That would
Do you
be
speak
a
from
very
experience
bad
there?
No, except indirect. My father was someone who was a pessimist and would, in a morose way, drink, and it would only make him more morose. Whereas Evelyn Waugh says about Charles Ryder, or Charles Ryder says of himself, rather, in Brideshead Revisited, that he drank for love of the moment and to prolong and to enhance it. And that's what I do. If the dinner party's going well, I want it to go on longer and louder, and for my own part in it to be more prominent and so forth. But if you drank because you had the blues, you'd be in big trouble. And then never say that I don't remember last night, because you do. Some hostesses will accept this excuse, but they shouldn't. Or rather, if you really don't remember, then you're in terrible trouble.
And has that happened to you often?
No, I have no amnesia at all. It's a quote from the same novel when Anthony Blanche says, I left school under a cloud, and he pauses and said, why do they call it that? It seems to me like a shaft of the most unwelcome light. No, if I was embarrassing to anyone or for any reason, which I don't necessarily confess that I was or am, the night before, the problem would be you'd remember it only too well. So I don't think it should be a socially acceptable excuse.
Well, look, as with all Hitchens conversations, we could go for hours, even just to exhaust the
I'm not going anywhere.
The heart puns and the limericks. But I thought we might open it up now to you guys who've come along this evening. There are several microphones.
No, Christopher, I'm a great admirer of your work.
Thank you.
Particularly your views on atheism.
Yes.
Which people of my generation particularly can ascribe to. But you wrote an article I'd like to take issue with in Vanity Fair, perhaps maybe 3 years ago. It was a brief article where you claimed that women were not funny.
Yeah.
I've had many discussions about this article with my friends, and I suppose I'd like you to talk to that, because the way I can sort of rebut that is, I know that you're a lover of literature, and I look at women like George Eliot and Jane Austen, and I think that how do we define a word like funny, and who owns the interpretation of that? Because in drawing rooms and in
I think we've got
kitchens and
gist.
Okay, you've got the gist. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like you to talk to that if you would.
You get it?
I got some of that.
No.
Seems to be some shrill, humorless bitch. The thing is this, and she began very sweetly by saying that atheism was an important principle, which it is, and I'll just say this about that. One of the threads of my book is the struggle to find a position that's consistently anti-totalitarian. I think that's a responsibility everybody has, whatever their other politics are. And the original form of dictatorship, as George Orwell points out, is theocratic. The first declaration of independence you have to make before you can really assail the totalitarian position is to say that there can be no celestially imposed, unalterable dictatorship. That's the most sinister kind of war. Now, to the lady's point, some people think that by asking the question why women aren't funny, which, by the way, is making the assumption that they're not, that I mean that there are no female comedians or wits. Not so. But you will notice of Roseanne Barr and Sarah Silverman Say, for example, both of whom wrote to me saying they thought I was right about this, that the female comedian is either a dyke or a Jew, or in some other way a man. And they're funny to precisely that extent. And that there are biological and evolutionary reasons why this should be so. If you, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you, if you tonight are talking to a friend who says, if it's a she, I've just found a great new chap, it's a moral certainty that she'll say, and he really makes me laugh. You've heard it, haven't you? When did you last hear a guy saying, I've found a really precious new squeeze, and then he'll say a couple of other things that I'm not going to share with you. And he's not going to say, and she keeps me in stitches. Or if he does...
Does that say something about women or the priorities of men?
No, it's both, because women don't need to be funny. They can be if they want, but they have no need to be in order to make themselves attractive. They are, to men, if you follow me, already attractive. Whereas for most men, what are their chances of getting laid if they're not funny? It's all we've got, darling, and we cherish it. Okay?
But I must say, I think there's an interesting point that arises in your memoir, follows from that question, and in particular your answer to it. It did strike me in the book that...
Oh, we're back.
Sorry, yes, yeah, for sure.
Did you miss me?
Oh, it was terrible. It was far cleaner in the masses. It did strike me that you seem to write, I think, quite viciously about women often. And I think you seem to be far less generous.
Well, tell me what I was vicious about.
You refer to the incident of visiting the prostitute with Martin Amis, where you describe her as I'm trying to remember the adjective you used, but it's the something bitch. Avaricious bitch.
Avaricious
That's
bitch.
right.
Well,
yeah.
She was. She was a greedy little minx, yeah.
Well, without...
You could see it in her eyes.
Without citing chapter and verse...
And she did have, I add, she had one of the most evil faces I've ever seen on a human being.
Well,
she was...
You're somewhat affirming the premise of my question as we proceed.
She was bewitching, in other words. But there, I mean, I have a duty to verisimilitude. I mean, that was the case with that terrible cat house on Lexington Avenue. But the most sordid morning I've ever spent in my life.
Sure. You write affectionately about your mother, about very few other women. And
Mrs. Thatcher.
And indeed affectionately there too. But...
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, well, as I've already... Azar Nafizi, author, a great friend of mine, author of the unbelievably brilliant, beautiful book, Reading Lolita in Tehran, which if you haven't read, you should. He was a tremendous defender of the rights of the downtrodden and raped and dispossessed women of Iran. But no, I'm sorry to say this girl in the Happy Isles knocking shop was a real, woof, boy. Even now, I can think of it. But it was the greatest. That outing with Martin to the handjob parlour was the best example I can think of turning lead into gold, because it was fantastically sordid and nasty and depressing expedition he made me come on. Field work, he said, for his novel, Likely Story, where this girl tried to keep on bidding me up all the time. Every time I agreed to a price, she'd raise it. As I say in my report of it, the price was the only thing in the room that showed any sign of enlarging itself. But when I would later read the relevant chapter of Martin's novel Money, I realized it was all fine. That these girls didn't know it, these avaricious minxes, but they were in the service of literature that day. And they've written an imperishable page.